Steam on Country Roads by Richard Jefferies. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Steam on Country Roads by Richard Jefferies. Losses year after year and increasing competition indicate that the crops now grown are not sufficient to support the farmer. When he endeavours, however, to vary his method of culture, and to introduce something new, he is met at the outset by two great difficulties which crush out the possibility of enterprise. The first of these, the extraordinary tithe, has already come into prominent notice. The second is really even more important. It is the deficiency of transit. An extensive use of steam on common roads appears essential to a revival of agricultural prosperity, because without it, it is almost impossible for delicate and perishable produce to be quickly and cheaply brought to market. Railways, indeed, now connect nearly every town of any size whatever throughout the country with the large cities or London. But railways are necessarily built as lines of communication between towns, and not in reference to scattered farms. Upon the map, the spaces between the various rails do not look very broad, but those white bands, when actually examined, would be found to be 6, 8, 10, or even 20 miles wide. Nor are there stations everywhere, so that a farm which may be only 6 miles from the metals may be 10 from the nearest platform. Goods trains do not, as in the United States, stop to pick up wherever there is material or produce waiting to be loaded. The produce has to be taken where the railway chooses, and not where it would suit the farmer's convenience. When at last the farmer's wagon reaches the station, he finds no particular trouble taken to meet his needs. His horse and carters are kept hours and hours, perhaps far into the night, for a mere matter of a ton or two. Nor is there any special anxiety shown to deliver his consignment early, though if it should not be moved from the company's premises, demurrage is charged. In short, the railway companies, knowing that the agriculturists until the formation of the Farmers' Alliance were incapable of united action, have used them much as they liked. As for the rates charged, the evidence recently taken, and which is to be continued, shows that they are arbitrary and often excessive. The accommodation is poor in the extreme, the charge is high, the speed low, and every condition against the farmer. This, in its turn, drives the farmer more into the hands of the middleman. The latter makes a study of the rail and its awkward ways, and manages to get the goods through, of course adding to their cost when they reach the public. Without the dealer, under present circumstances, the farmer would often find it practically impossible to get to markets not in his immediate neighbourhood. The rail and its awkward, inconvenient ways actually shut him off. In manufacturing districts, the transit of iron and minerals and worked-up metal is managed with considerable ability. There are appointed to manage the goods traffic men, who are alert to the conditions of modern requirements and quick to meet them. In agricultural districts, the question often arises if there be really any responsible local goods managers at all. It seems to be left to men who are little more than labourers, and who cannot understand the patent fact that times are different now from what they were 30 years since, when they first donned their uniforms. The railways may bring their books and any number of their officers to prove that everything is perfectly satisfactory, but the feeling remains, nevertheless, that it is exactly the contrary. Look at the map and place the finger on any of the spaces between the lines of rail. Take, then, the case of a farmer in the midst of that space, not more than 5 or 6 miles from the metals, and able at times to hear the distant whistle of the engines, but not less than 8 from a station. This present season he finds his wheat damaged by the rain after it was cut, and he comes to the conclusion that he must supplement his ordinary crops by some special culture in order to make his way. On the last occasion he was in a large city he was much struck by the quantity of fruit which he found was imported from abroad. The idea naturally occurs to him of setting aside some 10 or 20 acres of his holding of 400 or 500 for the culture of fruit. He goes to his landlord, who is only too willing to give him every facility, provided that no injury be done to the soil. He faces the monstrous injustice of the extraordinary tithes, and expends fresh capital in the planting of various kinds of fruit. In places at that distance from a station, labour is dear relative to the low profit on the ordinary style of farming, but very cheap relative to the possible profits on an improved and specialised system. The amount of extra labour he thus employs in the preparation of the ground, the planting, cleaning, picking, and packing, is an inestimable boon to the humbler population. Not only men, but women and children can assist at times, and earn enough to add an appreciable degree of comfort to their homes. In itself this is a valuable result. But now suppose our enterprising farmer has the fortune to have a good season, and to see his 20 acres teeming with produce. He sets as many hands on as possible to get it in, but now what is he to do with it? Send it to London? That is easily said, but trace the process through. The goods, perishable and delicate, must first be carted to the railway station and delivered there, 8 miles from the farm, at most inconvenient hours. They must be loaded into slow goods trains which may not reach town for 24 hours. There is not the slightest effort to accelerate the transit, and the rates are high. By the time the produce reaches the market its gloss and value are diminished, and the cost of transit has eaten away the profit. The thing has been tried over and over again and demonstrated. One need only go to the nearest greengrocer's to obtain practical proof of it. The apples he sells are American. The farmers in New York State or Massachusetts can grow apples, pack them in barrels, dispatch them 2,800 miles to Liverpool, and they can then be scattered all over the country and still sold cheaper than the fruit from English orchards. This is an extraordinary fact, showing the absolute need of speedy and cheap transit to the English farmer if he is to rise again. Of what value is his proximity to the largest city in the world, of what value is it that he is only 90 miles from London, if it cost him more to send his apples about 90 miles than it does his American kinsman very nearly 3,000? As we have in this country no great natural waterways like the rivers and lakes of the United States, our best resource is evidently to be found in the development of the excellent common roads which traverse the country, and may be said practically to pass every man's door. Upon these a goods train may be run to every farm, and loaded at the gate of the field. This assertion is not too bold. The thing, indeed, is already done in a manner much more difficult to accomplish than that proposed. Traction engines, weighing many tons, so heavy as to sometimes endanger bridges, and drawing 2 trucks loaded with tons of coal, chalk, bricks, or other materials, have already been seen on the roads, travelling considerable distances, and in no wise impeded by steep gradients. So little, indeed, that they ascend the downs and supply farms situated in the most elevated positions with fuel. What is this but a goods train, and a goods train of the clumsiest, most awkward, and consequently unprofitable description? Yet it is run, and it would not be run were it not to some extent useful. Anything more hideous it would be hard to conceive. Yet if the world patiently submits to it for the welfare of the agricultural community, what possible objection can there be to engines so formed as to avoid every one of the annoyances caused by it? It may be asserted without the slightest fear of contradiction that there are at least 50 engineering firms in this country who could send forth a road locomotive very nearly noiseless, very nearly smokeless, certainly sparkless, capable of running up and down hill on our smooth and capital roads, perfectly under control, not in the least alarming to horses, and able to draw 2 or more trucks or passenger cars round all their devious windings at a speed at least equal to that of a moderate trot, say 8 miles an hour. Why, then, do we not see such useful road trains running to and fro? Why, indeed? In the first place, progress in this direction is absolutely stopped by the Acts of Parliament regulating agricultural engines. The Act in question was passed at a time when steam was still imperfectly understood. It was in itself a perfectly judicious Act, which ought to be even more strictly enforced than it is. But it was intended solely and wholly for the regulation of those vast and monstrous looking engines which it was at once foreseen, if left to run wild, would frighten all horse traffic off the roads. The possibility of road locomotives in the reasonable sense of the term was not even in the minds of the framers. Yet, by a singular perversity, this very Act has shut off steam from one of its most legitimate functions. It is quite possible that the depression of agriculture may have the effect of drawing attention to this subject, and if so, it will be but tardy justice to the rest of society that the very calling whose engines now block the roads should thus in the end open them. We should then see goods trains passing every farm and loading at the gate of the field. Such a road goods train would not, of course, run regularly to and fro in the same stereotyped direction, but would call as previously ordered, and make 3 or 4 journeys a day, sometimes loading entirely from one farm, sometimes making up a load from several farms in succession. Besides the quick communication thus opened up with the railway station and the larger towns, the farmer would be enabled to work his tenancy with fewer horses. He would get manures, coal, and all other goods delivered for him instead of fetching them. He would get his produce landed for him, instead of sending his own teams, men, and boys. In a short time, as the railways began to awaken to the new state of things, they would see the advantage of accommodating their arrangements, and open their yards and sidings to their competitor. In the case of long journeys, and with some kinds of goods, in order to save the cost of transhipment, it would be possible to transfer the bed of the road truck from its frame onto the frame of the railroad truck, so that the goods, with one loading, might pass direct to London. Our American cousins are quite capable of inventing a transferable truck of this kind. In return, goods loaded in London would never leave the same bottom till unloaded at the farmyard or in the midst of the village. For all long journeys the rails would probably always remain the great carriers, and the road trains serve as their most valuable feeders. When farmers found it possible to communicate with the cities at reasonable rates and at reasonable speed, they would be encouraged to put forth fresh efforts, to plant vegetables, to grow fruit, to supplement their larger crops with every species of lesser produce. This, in its turn, would bring new traffic to the lines. For instead of 1 or 2 crops in the year only, there would be 3 or 4 requiring carriage. There would be then speedy results of such improved communication. One would be an increased value of land; the second, an increase in the number of small areas occupied and cultivated; the third, an increase in the rural population. A fourth would be that the incredible amount of money which is now annually transferred to the Continent and America for the purchase of every kind of lesser produce would remain in this country to the multiplication of the accounts at post office savings banks. Every one who possibly could would grow or fatten something when he could just put it on a road train and send it off to market. 2 through passenger road trains a day, one in each direction, carrying light parcels as well, and traversing say 40 or 50 miles or less, would probably soon obtain sufficient support as they ran from village to village and market town to market town. At present, those who live in villages are practically denied locomotion unless they are well enough off to keep a horse and trap and a man to look after them. A person residing in a village must either remain in the village, or walk, or go by carrier. The carrier stops at every inn, and takes a day to get over 10 miles. The exposure in the carrier's cart has been the cause of serious illness to many, and many a poor woman obliged to travel by it, and sit in the wind and rain for hours and hours together. Unless they ride in this vehicle, or tramp on foot, the villagers are simply shut off from the world. They have neither omnibus, tramway, nor train. Those who have not lived in a village have no idea of the isolation possible even in this 19th century, and with the telegraph brought to the local post office. The swift message of the electric wire and the slow transit of the material person, the speed of the written thought and the slowness of the bodily presence are in strange contrast. When people do not move about freely, commerce is practically at a standstill. But if two passenger road trains, travelling at an average speed of not more than 8 miles an hour, one going up and the other down, and connecting 2 or more market towns and lines of railway, pass through the village, how different would be the state of things! Ease of transit multiplies business, and besides passengers a large amount of light material could thus be conveyed. There would be depots at the central places, but such trains could stop to pick up travellers at any gate, door, or stile. If the route did not go through every hamlet, it would pass near enough to enable persons to walk to it and join the carriages. No one objects to walk 1 mile if he can afterwards ride the other 10. Besides these through trains, special trains could run on occasions when numbers of people wanted to go to one spot, such as sheep or cattle fairs, and great markets. Large tracts of country look to one town as their central place, not by any means always the nearest market town. To such places, for instance, as Gloucester and Reading, thousands resort in the course of the year from hamlets at a considerable distance. Such road trains as have been described would naturally converge on provincial towns of this kind, and bring them thrice their present trade. Country people only want facilities to travel exactly like city people. It is, indeed, quite possible that when villages thus become accessible, many moderately well-to-do people will choose them for their residence, in preference to large towns, for health and cheapness. If any number of such persons took up their residence in villages, the advantage to farmers would of course be that they would have good customers for all minor produce at their doors. It is not too much to say that 3 parts of England are quite as much in need of opening up as the backwoods of America. When a new railroad track is pushed over prairie and through primeval woods, settlements spring up beside it. When road trains run through remote hamlets, those remote hamlets will awake to a new life. Many country towns of recent years have made superhuman efforts to get the railway to their doors. Some have succeeded, some are still trying. In no case has it been accomplished without an immense expenditure, and for the most part these railroad branches are completely in the control of the main line with which they are connected. In 1 or 2 cases progress has been effected by means of tramways, notably one at Wantage, an excellent idea and highly to be commended. All these are signs that by slow degrees matters are tending towards some such scheme as has been here sketched out. While local railroads are extremely expensive, slow in construction, and always dominated by main lines, and while tramways need rails, with the paraphernalia rails require, they have this drawback: they are not flexible. The engines and cars that run upon them must for ever adhere to the track. There may be goods, produce, ricks, cows, fruit, hops, and what not, wanting to be landed only a quarter of a mile distant, but the cars cannot go to the crops. The railroad is rigid, everything must be brought to it. From town to town it answers well, but it cannot suit itself and wind about from village to hamlet, from farm to farm, up hill and down dale. The projected road train is flexible and capable of coming to the crops. It can call at the farmer's door and wait by the gate of the field for the load. We have lately seen France devote an enormous sum to the laying down of rails in agricultural districts, to the making of canals, and generally to the improvement of internal communication in provinces but thinly populated. The industrious French have recognized that old countries whose area is limited can only compete with America, whose area is almost unlimited, by rendering transit easy and cheap. we in England shall ultimately have to apply the same fact. End of Steam on Country Roads, by Richard Jefferies.